Welcome, everyone. I'm Don Swear, the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to the fifth in this year's series entitled Ecologies of Human Flourishing. Our event and the entire series has been co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of World Religions, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, the Initiative on Religion at the Kennedy Center, and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. And I want to thank all of them for helping support this series. The final event in the series will be a lecture here in the Sperry Room on March 25th on Thoreau and Voluntary Simplicity by Larry Buell, the Cabot Professor of American Literature here at Harvard. In collaboration with the Harvard Business School, we've also added an event to the schedule for Monday, April the 12th, also here in the Sperry Room, entitled What's Enough? There is information over here on the table, which I would urge you to get on your way out if you haven't already, about the series, and also an announcement of the event with the Harvard Business School, What's Enough? I also wanted to announce, and I hope I can remember at the end of the event as well, that there will be a reception for everyone here across the street at the Center for the Study of World Religions after the conclusion of the event. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Bill McKibben, who will speak on Reality Check: How the Facts of Life on a Tough New Planet Shape Our Choices, and also our respondent, Professor Dan Schrag. A 21st century Thoreauian, Bill McKibben is a gifted writer, educator, environmentalist, and social critic. His first book, The End of Nature, first published in 1989 and revised in 2006, has appeared in more than 20 languages and compares, I think, in public significance with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Jonathan Schell's The Fate of the Earth. These books addressed three different global environmental problems: toxic contamination of the food chain, worldwide consequences of nuclear proliferation, and the impact of global warming. These warnings influenced, I think, major changes in national and international policy: the banning of the widespread use of DDT as a pesticide, the START treaties that negotiated nuclear arms reduction agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the Kyoto Protocol to limit carbon dioxide emissions. Individual people can make a difference. Environmental concerns are at the very heart of Bill McKibben's commitments. He's founded two major national and international grassroots environmental movements to galvanize the urgency of addressing the environmental crisis: Step It Up in 1997, and more recently the 350.org campaign that has won the support of many international leaders, including Bishop Desmond Tutu, Vandana Shiva, and Dr. James Hansen. Several of his other monographs address the environment from perspectives ranging from personal narratives to case studies: Hope, Human and Wild; Wandering Home, A Long Walk Across America's Landscapes; and Comforting Whirlwind, God, Job, and the Scale of Creation. There may be jobs there too, I don't know. Bill McKibben's articles have appeared in over a dozen major periodicals, including the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and National Geographic. Three of his most influential books are of the genre of social criticism. The Age of Missing Information contrasts watching hundreds of hours of cable TV with observing nature in his beloved Adirondack Mountains. The national bestseller, Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities and the Durable Future, critiques the paradigm of more is better growth economy, and Enough, Staying Human in an Engineered Age, examines the existential dangers of genetic engineering, robotics, and nanotechnology. Much in demand as a public speaker, Bill has received numerous national fellowships and awards. He served as a visiting fellow at several colleges and universities, including Harvard, and is now a scholar in residence at Middlebury College. Daniel Schrag is professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences here at Harvard and director of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. He studies climate and climate change over the broadest range of Earth history. A former MacArthur Fellow, he's widely published in scientific journals. His research ranges from studies in changes in ocean circulation over the last several decades, in particular attention to El Nino and the tropical Pacific, to theories of Pleistocene ice age cycles, including a better determination of ocean temperatures during the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. Dan Schrag has helped to develop the snowball Earth hypothesis, proposing that a series of global glaciations that occurred millions of years ago may have led to the evolution of multicellular animals. Currently, he is working with economists and engineers on technological approaches to mitigating future climate change. I want to take this particular occasion to express my deepest thanks and appreciation to Dan as a colleague and a friend. He's been a great supporter of the CSWR and to me during my tenure as director. I'm particularly grateful for his willingness to join in such interdisciplinary efforts as the Ecologies of Human Flourishing series, of which this lecture is a part, and the Ethics and Environment Conference we co-sponsored a few years ago that resulted in the volume Ecology and the Environment, Perspectives from the Humanities, and it's available for purchase through the Harvard University Press. So, with this as perhaps more of an introduction than I should have made, but much shorter than I could have made, will you join me in welcoming both Bill McKibben and Dan?
Thank you very much. Now, when they asked me to come, there were many reasons I said yes, and one of them was that Dan would be here, and there's really no one whose thoughts on all these questions I value much more. And one of them was I knew I'd see all kinds of friends, and one of them was that I liked the title, The Ecologies of Human Flourishing. It's a beautiful notion. And one of the chief among them was just the chance to see and be able to pay some tribute to Don, who's I first met a very long time ago when I was a very young writer in my 20s and had just published The End of Nature and was asked to go off, for reasons I'm not clear how I sort of got asked, but to Thailand to give a talk to sort of ecologists and Buddhists in Thailand. And we were in Chiang Mai, near Chiang Mai, and I hadn't given very many talks, and I was giving a talk, and it was at night, and we were outdoors, and there was a bright white light shining on me, and I was wearing a white shirt, and as a result, I was a sort of magnet for the most unbelievable assortment of large insects that kept appearing and landing on me. And I mean, things the size of, moths the size of, red-tailed hawks and things would sort of appear. And I for whatever reason, I would sort of carefully lift them off. I don't remember anything I said that night, but I remember Don came up to me afterward and said, well, you did a good job, because those were all Buddhists watching, and if you had just swatted them away, they wouldn't have listened to a thing you said. So I was always grateful for that, and I've remembered it. What little I know about public speaking. This question of how we're going to flourish is such a nice way to put it. Another way to put it, a more direct way, one that sort of people ask me all the time, is what can we do now? What can we do about the situation that we're in? What can we do is a question that we've hardly even considered for the last 300 or 400 years, because the answer to it has always been implicit. We can do anything we want, as much of it as we can think of. And so what we've done is an awful lot. We've gone to the moon. More incredibly, we've learned how at least the top 20 or 30% of the world to fly each other around the planet again and again and again, and on the most flimsy of reasons, just appearing hither and yon as if by magic. We've built enormous homes and built enormous vehicles to drive us in between them. There's been very little that we couldn't do, and the reason for that is because we've had in that period access to cheap fossil fuel. That's been the single most important feature of modern life. It's what we call modern life. Every action of that life is intimately tied to the combustion of that fossil fuel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in at least the wealthy parts of the world. That's now ending. It's going to end for two reasons. One, we're starting to run short of this magic stuff that we've been using for several centuries. We don't know exactly how short we're going to run or how exactly it'll manifest itself, but the people who talk about the peak oil phenomenon are, in the largest sense, I think, correct. We can see the beginning of the end of access to endless cheap supplies of fossil fuel. Even more important, we're running up against deep physical limits, mostly in the ability of the atmosphere to cope with the byproducts of burning all that fossil fuel. And the gradual accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere has now begun inexorably the process of heating the planet with really dramatic effect. This isn't a kind of new notion. Atmospheric chemists and physicists have worried about it for more than a century. Arrhenius, the great Swedish chemist, the first to do so before the turn of the last century. But we never really knew when the problem would manifest in the deepest ways. Not until the 1980s, when we began to have computer models sufficiently powerful enough to really give us some sense. And really, even then, not until the last decade, when we began to see with our own eyes the unmistakable effects of that kind of change. The fact that sea ice across the Arctic melted so spectacularly in the summer of 2007. The fact that people in Dan's line of work have now made it very clear that we're rapidly acidifying the planet's oceans, something that we really even hadn't considered as a possibility until fairly recently. On and on and on. I could obviously elaborate for a very long time on the facts of climate change and what we're seeing. I'm not going to bother to do that. I think there's no real need. Suffice it to say that we have a rough sense of what those limits are. In January of 2008, our foremost climatologist on this planet, Jim Hansen at NASA, and his team published a paper saying that in the roughest possible terms, 350 parts per million CO2 was as much as we better let out in the atmosphere. In fact, the way they put it in the abstract of that journal article, and this is pretty strong language for a scientific journal, is any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong language. Stronger language when you know that we're well past that already at 390 parts per million and rising steadily. These 350 represents no exact cutoff. It represents the obvious fact now that we've already gone past the place where we should be. That wherever the proper limit it's behind us now, and we need to work with much greater urgency than we have in the past to finally even begin to address these problems. Given those limits, it strikes me that a new logic prevails if we're going to talk about human flourishing, and that our sense of what we need and want out of the world will change with it. That the constant emphasis on endless growth and expansion of economies will begin to seem less desirable and less important, and that a different set of goals and aspirations will become more powerful. That security and stability will seem more and more attractive to us as opposed to growth, especially in those parts of the world that have already made it that have already reached some level of affluence necessary to support dignified lives. It's a much more excruciating problem in those parts of the world that have not yet done so. But I think in general that all the kind of glory associated with concept of growth will begin to tarnish, and that instead words like stability, concepts like hunkering down, will become more and more and more the kind of lingo that we adopt, that maturity will become our credo instead of growth. I think also that there's a kind of second logical and even more important development that will flow more or less naturally from the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel age. And that is that the constant tendency, the constant logic of cheap fossil fuel has been to centralize things, and that the logic of what comes next will be to disperse and localize them. Let's look at a few commodities just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Our food system, for instance, is now essentially a centralized and industrial operation. Very few people producing the food that we eat on relatively limited acreage, and doing it with the help of almost unbelievable quantities of fossil fuel, between the production of fertilizer, between the traction necessary to till the fields, between the transport of the food once it's harvested. These are enough to ensure that the food you eat is essentially marinated in crude oil before it reaches your lips. That's not a system, I think, that will last, and I think you can already begin to see it breaking down and begin to sense what comes after it. Local farmers' markets have been the fastest growing part of the American food economy for the last decade, with sales doubling and doubling again. That's very interesting to see. And there are places now where it's gone beyond a kind of small part of the food system to become a major, if not the major part of it. I don't know if people here have had the pleasure of being in Madison, Wisconsin on a Saturday when their amazing farmers market draws often 100,000 people to the streets around the Capitol. That's been enough to fundamentally rewrite the agricultural economics of that part of the state and change the value of land and the way that it's used. And we're beginning to see that around the country. The last agricultural census, last 5-year agricultural census in this country showed a pretty remarkable increase in the number of farms. For the first time in about 125 years, farms, instead of constantly declining, the number of farms was on the uptick. Most of them in this category of small farms growing food for people to eat locally. Think about energy itself, the second most important commodity in our lives. Energy, under the old model, made great sense to have a few huge centralized power plants, say. There's about 500 or 600 scattered around the U.S. that provide almost all the electricity that we use, and the majority of electricity comes from burning coal in order to produce that electricity. If we begin to move away from those fossil fuels, which were magnificent mostly because they were concentrated, rich in BTUs, and easy to transport, and begin to rely instead on renewable energy, a whole different set of logical paradigms operate. Sun and wind are widely dispersed. They're available everywhere, but they're available in not as large and concentrated a quantity. That is, I have solar panels on my rooftop. Okay, on a sunny day, I'm a utility. I'm firing electrons down the grid. And one can imagine and begin to see in operation a grid that looks more like a farmer's market in energy than the centralized model we have at the moment. Now, you can take that farther than it's need to take it. There are still remain concentrated pockets of good wind and intense sun on this continent and others that will exploit more than other places. But in essence, one begins to see a multinodal energy system, what the engineers call distributed generation, as the replacement for the very centralized systems that we have. More speculatively, but beginning to happen now, one begins to see maybe the third most important commodity on this planet, capital, beginning to, at least you could begin to understand why you might want to disperse it in some of those ways. The astonishing failure of one big money center bank or investment house after another 2 years ago that came very close to bringing the world's economy down with it was a reminder that things that are too big to fail shouldn't be allowed to be that big. It's not that they shouldn't be, we should figure out some way to keep them from failing. It's that we should keep them from getting big enough that their failure is a problem. And just in the same, I mean, if you look around the country, most small banks, at least at first, before the ripple effects of the recession caused by those big banks' failures began to work its way down, did okay. In places where people knew who they were lending to and what that meant and whatever, we've had many fewer problems. That decreased vulnerability of systems in general, I think, is one of the things that will be very nice about the world that comes after. Take, for instance, that solar panel on my roof. Theoretically, some terrorist could take an interest in it and climb up on my roof and destroy it, take a hammer to it, you know. But if he did, the only person who'd really be damaged would be me, and there would be no sort of deadly solar particles, you know, floating out into the atmosphere. The same thing happens in an economy built on small banks. The unwise decisions at, you know, First Middlebury Bank might be enough to cause it and its shareholders problems, but they're not enough to cause any problem upstream. The way that the failure of Lehman or AIG or whatever clearly did. It's very good, therefore, to see experiments in new ways of distributing capital. One of the most interesting in the country that I've just done some writing about in the western part of this state, where there are now about 3 million Berkshires in circulation, an alternative complementary currency that one can get at regular FDIC chartered banks. You can cash your paycheck in US dollars and or in Berkshires. And the way that that money recirculates in the local economy is powerful to see. Those kind of experiments are very useful and good, and I think we'll see more of them. And I think that as this happens, and this gets to the title of this series, as this happens, the possibility for human flourishing is very much there in a way that maybe it hasn't been for the last 100 years or so, which, however else you make it out, hasn't, I think, been the greatest epoch, at least in this country, for that kind of flourishing. The biggest impact on our lives of fossil fuel, I would argue, has been in a way to make us lonelier people than we were before. By allowing us, encouraging us to do a series of things that weren't possible without access to that cheap fossil fuel, we've fallen into a number of traps. If you think about what the American economy has mostly done since the end of World War II, by far the biggest part of its vigor has been spent on the project of building bigger homes farther apart from each other. Okay? A process that perhaps has now reached its zenith with the collapse of the housing market in the wake of this last recession. But not only did that project require immense amounts of energy to build and heat and light and cool these homes and drive between them, it also, I think, had profound effects on who we were. The average American in 1950 ate twice as many meals with friends and family and neighbors as the average American at the moment. The average American in 1950 had twice as many friends, close friends, as the average American now. those are enormous changes. Now, there are many explanations for what went on, and television clearly has played a role, and on and on and on. But simply the mathematical process of isolating ourselves in ever larger buildings, ever further apart from each other, has played an enormous role in these deep, deep changes. Human satisfaction in this country, the number of Americans who say they're very satisfied with their lives, peaked sometime in the mid-1950s and has been slowly declining ever since, even as our standard of living has almost trebled over that period of time. Something's not allowing us to flourish. And my guess is that there are things implicit in this new world that we're coming to that will be more useful for that purpose. I'll give you just one statistic that I like. Farmers markets, which I already said were the fastest growing part of our food economy. That's because people want good food and so on and so forth. But the real reason, I think, is because they want the contact that those places provide. A pair of sociologists several years ago followed shoppers, first around the supermarket, then around the farmers market. You all have been to the supermarket. You know how it works. You walk in, you fall into a light fluorescent trance, you visit the Stations of the Cross around the supermarket, you emerge somehow with the same basket of goods you had the week before. That's about it. When they followed shoppers around the farmers market, they found that they were having, on average, 10 times more conversations per visit. Okay? Beginning to re-knit some of that lost sense of community that is at the root of much of the lack of flourishing around us. That's, to my mind, the good news. The bad news is that even as we localize, we still have a series of acute global problems that we somehow have to deal with, climate change being the most important of all. And so now I'm going to switch from conjecture about things to just telling you a few stories about how I've spent the last few years of my life, because actually it's involved very little intellectual effort and a great deal of sort of organizing effort, trying to figure out how to build a movement finally to do something, put some pressure on about climate change in a way that there had not been either nationally or internationally. Because, among other things, we have to figure out we can't deal with this problem of climate one community at a time. It simply do not have the time, and the scale is too large. We have to figure out how to globally and nationally put a price on carbon, take effective action to cap its production. That's a political task above all, and there's no way around that. When we started trying to figure out how to build a movement, and I had no experience doing any of this and no idea what I was doing in the fall of 2006 when we started. In fact, the very first thing we did was I had just come back from a kind of heart-wrenching trip to Bangladesh, and I've got to do something. I don't know how to do anything. I'm a writer. I live in the woods. What am I going to do? I called up some of my friends, other writers in Vermont, said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to Burlington, which is our main city, and we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll be arrested, and there'll be a little story in the paper, and at least we will have done something. And the writers, oh, that's an excellent plan. Let's do that. And except that somebody was smart enough to call the police in Burlington, ask what would happen. The police said, well, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, you know. And so we called off that plan and instead did this march across Vermont, and we had, by the time we were done, there's a few people in this room who were there. By the time we were done, we had about 1,000 people, which in Vermont, I mean, you all are sophisticated Bay Staters, but in Vermont, 1,000 people is, except for UVM hockey games, that's as many people as ever assemble for any purpose. And we got all our legislators come down to meet with us, and it was great. They all not only met with us, they signed this thing that they're going to work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 20. Not just the Democrats, the woman who almost won the GOP congressional, won our congressional seat that year, Republican, who had said 2 months before, she'd said, I'm not sure global warming is real. More research needs to be done. The more research that needed to be done was how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind? And 1,000 was sufficient. It gave us some sense that movement building was what we needed to do, because we opened the paper the next morning and there was a story that said that 1,000 people may have been the biggest single demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the U.S. Well, no wonder we're losing. We have the brightest minds in the country, people like Dan, hard at work in Washington and elsewhere with all the policies that we need. The trouble is they have nothing behind them, okay? And every senator can read a naked bluff in this, hand of cards. They know if there's no reason to pay attention to what's going on. And so we needed to build that. First, we did this thing around this country called Step It Up, and in the course of a few months with a few college students, we coordinated 1,400 rallies around the U.S. in the spring of 2007, and that was good because it got Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton to buy into this 80% cuts in carbon emissions, which was way more than they'd ever talked about before. That was fun. But it clearly wasn't enough. A few weeks later, the Arctic started to melt. Clearly we're going to need to work on a planetary scale. So we decided to see somewhat ludicrously if we could do that too, if we could organize on a global scale. And we took this number 350 as the kind of starting point, mostly, for two reasons. One, it at least attempted to set some kind of actual target so our leaders couldn't get away with just saying, we're taking action on climate change. And second, because the biggest problem for global organizing is everybody around the world insists on speaking their own language, Not just having their own religion, but speaking their own language. It makes it very difficult to communicate. Arabic numerals happily cross linguistic boundaries. So we set to work. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because I think it follows the same model as what I was talking about with food or energy or anything else. When we started organizing, old people who'd done this in the 60s said, what you have to do is have a march on Washington. That's how it's done. We said, we can't organize that. It's dumb to tell people to drive across America to protest global warming. And anyway, we now have this tool that will allow us to do things on a dispersed basis and make them add up to more than the sum of their parts. And we kind of beta tested it in the United States, and then we decided to see if we could do it on a global scale. We had 7 23-year-olds. That was the crew. And me, a sort of rapidly aging writer. 7 was a good number. There are 7 continents. Each one of them took one. The guy who got Antarctica also took the internet because it's its own continent, And off they set. This was 18 months ago. And they began organizing. And our goal was to take this number and push it into the middle of this debate, to sharpen the science of this debate some. We picked a date, October 24th of last fall. So we're going to do this all over the world on this day, figure out. Well, we didn't know what would happen. We organized like heck, and we had found great people everywhere. Still, a major challenge. We gathered in New York a few days before, our core crew, to kind of do the final push, and basically to sit by our computers and wait, because we told everybody to upload images as soon as their rallies and things took place. And I'll show you a couple of slides now just to give you some sense. I'll cut to the chase. The thing worked, okay, at least on its own terms. There were 5,200 rallies in 181 countries. It was, CNN said, the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. Foreign Policy just did a piece a couple of weeks ago saying the largest ever coordinated global rally of any kind. We got a sense it was going to start working a couple of days early. And I'll just tell you this story to give you some sense of how we organized. We got a call from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia from an 18-year-old girl. We trained her and her sister, her 19-year-old sister, at a little climate camp we did in South Africa. And sort of trained, and then we'd gone back to Ethiopia. People scattered, young people back all over the continent. We didn't hear much from them because the internet doesn't work very well in much of Africa. We got this call on Thursday, and Aliyah saying, well, it's going really good. We've got 15,000 people demonstrating in the streets of Addis Ababa for 350. And we were like, well, that's really good. And she said, the only problem is we can't get you a picture because the internet's down again. No, because we really need this picture to show to AP and Reuters so we can get coverage. We finally found the one hotel in Addis with the sort of where all the development people go, kind of Western hotel. And we sent the first two people that they sent in got kicked out because they were black, but finally we found a white person, and they went in and sat at the bar and ordered a drink and pushed the button. And a few minutes later we had pictures from Addis, and a few minutes after that they were up all over the world. And after that they just started to pour in. A couple of minutes later, these American soldiers in Afghanistan sent us this 350 they made with sandbags that were parking our Humvee for the weekend. Then the day just sort of started unfolding.
The lights, please.
Yeah, maybe there's a way to get those lights out. I'll move this chair. And then it just sort of rolling around the world. And some of them are so beautiful that it was, just hard to look at them without breaking into tears. Mostly, and this is the point I want to make, okay? If you've been told at some point in your life that environmentalists are rich white people, pay attention to these pictures. Most of them are of poor, brown, black, Asian, and young people because that's what the world is mostly composed of, all right? And they are every bit as interested and concerned, and in many cases more so, because they're dealing right now with already the effects of what we're seeing. We had 300 big demonstrations across India organized by young people. So I didn't know where that is. I thought it was appropriate for Don to show that mountain someplace, sacred mountain somewhere. And some of them came. These guys didn't have a digital camera. They took these are dugout canoes on the Congo River, someplace near Kinshasa. They took a picture. It didn't come out so well, so they wrote what was on their banner on the thing, and then they found someone who could scan it in and send it to us. But someplace on the Congo River, someone had gotten this same T-shirt that I'm wearing and the same message. Just place after place, we had a lot of big underwater demonstrations. Istanbul had the worst flooding in its history 6 weeks before. There were huge gatherings there. A lot of public art. That's from the Space Needle in Seattle. That's the colors of the Venezuelan flag. I like that picture of Tahiti. That's an operating room in Puerto Rico. Hopefully they didn't stop for too long. Those are lantern dancers in Australia. This picture I wanted to show today because one of the things that really worked was a deep involvement of religious communities for the first time in this kind of work. This is the head of Muslim South Africa. This guy is I don't know what his title is, but he's a prominent representative of sort of native religion in South Africa. And that's Desmond Tutu's successor as Archbishop, Anglican Archbishop in the crimson behind them there. They led this big march through Cape Town. That's a Pentecostal school someplace in Ghana. The perfect example of environmental foundation. Wheaton College, where Billy Graham went to school and where even a few years ago there would not have been an environmental demonstration, and now there was, something that made me very pleased. I'm kind of keeping all of you from seeing it there. So I can move this a little bit.
That's not bad. You just unplugged.
It's all right. It's just a power cord. Yeah. I'd been to Bethlehem a few weeks before trying to organize. Not an easy place to get to and not an easy place to organize. But everybody there said, we want to really work on this. The Dead Sea is shrinking. In Jordan we'll make the 3, in Palestine we'll make the 5, in Israel the 0. And we'll make the point that you got to work across borders. We did a lot of that kind of big Scrabble. That's from the top of the Red Fort in Delhi. That's Sydney, that's under the London Eye, that's in Copenhagen. Any place where we could find iconic locations. So in India, but in the U.S. it was an autumn weekend, so there's Syracuse football field and the cheerleaders, doing their thing. That's the sandbags in Boston Harbor. You have a beautiful picture of Concord. Just on and on and on. Those are across Africa, birders got together to find 350 species that weekend. Bhopal, the scene of the greatest environmental crime of the last century. It just moved me to see people still willing to kind of engage with the rest of the world even. Lots and lots of climbers. That's in Table Mountain in South Africa. I show you this just so you can get a sense of scale. That's the same banner in Soweto, headquarters of resistance to lots of things. They did 350 bungee jumps, but the reason that I show you the picture is they strung the bungee cord between two cooling towers from a defunct coal-fired power plant. This is the use to which we need to put coal-fired power plants in the future. That's one of my students in Middlebury had a time-lapse camera. Sap buckets in Vermont. We had 300 big demonstrations across China. Only one got broken up by the police. The rest, the young people we were working with, were savvy enough to figure out how to sort of walk up to the line and not cross it. Those are youth in the China Youth Climate Network in Inner Mongolia making a human wind turbine, and behind them you can see the world's largest turbine field. Lots of groups helped us all over the place, lots of places that you wouldn't expect. That woman started out that day with a big crowd of people, but they had to go through 6 U.S. Army checkpoints to get to the site of the old Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and she was the only one with the guts enough to keep going all the way through. That's one of my very favorite pictures. Honduras was under military curfew. It didn't matter. They had a big demonstration. In the Maldives, those are youth holding a meeting. The president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, trained his whole cabinet in scuba diving. They went underwater to pass a 350 resolution against the backdrop of their dying coral reef that day. People on a stump in Tasmania, beautiful art and all over the place. We didn't use celebrities. Numbers and scientists were the closest thing we had to celebrities because we wanted to avoid. We didn't think we needed to, that people would get this on their own, and they did. But we did take over Times Square for the day and take all those big jumbotrons that are usually used for vodka ads and things, and instead had these pictures. And people all around the world, I told them we were going to do this, and they got very excited. Put my picture in Times Square. So we did our best. We got amazing press coverage. We owned the Google News page for about 36 hours, and it was on the front page of almost all the papers. The point is that there were lots and lots and lots of places where people would say you shouldn't be able to organize. The 0 there, we had a whole file of pictures made up of women in burqas, Our stereotype is that these are not people who would be doing this kind of thing, but of course they care just as much about what their children's future looks like as anybody else. The oil sheikdom of Abu Dhabi, but they've begun to realize they'll run out of oil someday. Hence, they also have the world's largest solar array behind them there. Places I'd never heard of. We had a whole file that was just marked by the end of the weekend 350 adorable, with lots and lots of pictures. That girl in the middle just kills me every time. The Maldives, she's unlikely to be able to live in her country when she's full grown. The odds of the Maldives being a habitable place seem low. Those kids had all been born in the same day in August, and so their parents got back together. They'd met in the maternity ward, and they got back together for a kind of party to try to help their future. And from the sublime to the ridiculous, those are electric golf carts in Laguna Woods. Mostly poor people all over the world. People who spent the day cleaning up a very poor part of a very poor city. An orphanage in Indonesia where they spent the day doing a bottle pickup thing. They wrote us a note in broken English. It said, even though no one caring about us, we caring about the earth. Bangladesh, nobody got the day off in Bangladesh, which is where most of the world's T-shirts are made, but they stopped work long enough to do their kind of thing all over the country, and indeed they made a bunch of T-shirts, which is they do. I've shown you all these pictures. I could show you many more because there are 25,000 of them in our Flickr account. I won't. I'll just say all of this was really great, but it didn't carry the day. Not yet. We got to Copenhagen 6 weeks later. We managed to convince 117 of the world's nations to endorse this 350 target, which was unbelievable, way beyond our wildest imaginings. But they were the wrong 117. They were the poor countries and the vulnerable ones. The rich, powerful, and deeply fossil fuel addicted ones weren't ready to commit to anything at all at the conference, much less anything that would have accomplished very much. And they remain in that posture at the moment. Our country probably chief among them. There are more signs other places, I think, like China, of real engagement with this process than there is in the U.S. Senate at the moment. Maybe we'll see something happen in the next few weeks once we get through health care, but we're not going to count on that. Our plan for this year that we need your help with is to continue this kind of organizing around the world. The date I want you to circle on your calendar and I want you to spread word about to everyone is October 10th. That day we're going to have not a kind of global political rally like we did, but a global work party all over the world. And in thousands of places, people were putting up solar panels, laying out bike paths, digging community gardens, doing all those kind of things. Not in the belief that we can solve this problem one project at a time. We can't. The momentum is too strong, the world too large. But they'll help. More to the point, they'll help us make the point to our leaders that if we can do this work, then they sure as hell can too. You know? That if we can get up on the roofs of schools and put up solar panels, then people in the Senate can do the work that they're paid to do, of writing legislation and passing it, you know? We need to begin shaming some of those leaders and pushing them much harder than they've been pushed to do something. We need that kind of movement. One of the best parts of this, since we're here in the Divinity School, has been the deep involvement of religious communities. Nobody knows better than John and Mary Evelyn that 10 or 15 years ago, there was no religious environmental movement. But now, in large part, thanks to them and others, there is. And it's really coming of age. On this day, thousands of churches rang their bells 350 times. We had all kinds of Buddhists around the world doing 350 minutes of meditation and people prostrating themselves, you know, all kinds of interesting stuff. And that will continue on as we go into this year. Building that kind of power. I'm not at all convinced that we're going to win. It's not at all clear that it's, you know, we haven't waited altogether too long to get started. But I am convinced that the same model that I talked about in terms of food and energy is the one that we're going to have to draw on in terms of politics. People doing things in all kinds of places and then figuring out how to connect them together through this new architecture of communication that we have to be bigger than the sum of their parts, to figure out how to put real political pressure on this system, because otherwise, at least at the moment, there's very little sign of the change that we need happening. The ground for human flourishing of any kind is a relatively stable planet. If we can't do this work, then all the other things that I've talked about local food and whatever else, won't in the end really happen. You can be the best organic gardener in the world, but it's got to rain sometime, you know. And unless we can do this work very, very quickly, then much else will be impossible. But if we do it right, and we do this kind of political work, then much else becomes possible in the course of it, not the least of which is the building of real, meaningful, and tight bonds between people around the world of very different circumstance and background and belief and class, and race, and everything else. It was unbelievably moving to be sitting in New York watching these images stream in across the computer for 36 hours. For once, I really felt like all those old cliches about how people are all the same under the skin and whatever really were true in some sense. And it was a quite beautiful thing. It's a pleasure to get to share a few of them with you and to ask you for your help in the months and years ahead. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bill, very, very much for an informative and inspiring talk. Dan.
Wow. I love hearing Bill talk. Bill always reminds me of, makes me feel more hopeful. I've got to say, it's hard to be a climate scientist these days, especially this year. Watching the decline, you know, fewer than 40% of the American public thinks that climate change is even happening, according to the recent Pew poll. In fact, I think only like 15% actually think of it's actually serious. Those numbers are way down from last year, and the difference was the coal lobby spent about $300 million last year. People aren't actually aware of just how well organized and serious the interests are that are involved in this issue. But Bill gives us a lot of hope in terms of thinking about people around the world and the ability to motivate them, but also appealing to something that I think touches me in a particularly strong way, which has to do with human values. Values that we all share that climate scientists like myself are actually very uncomfortable talking about. Because we like to talk about observations, we get questioned. For example, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is in its nature the most conservative body in the world. They're afraid to say anything unless it's broadly agreed upon by hundreds of scientists. And nothing can be talked about unless it's in the published literature. There's been a big hullabaloo, I don't know if people have heard about it, about the melting of glaciers up in the Himalayas. The problem is, and this is actually true all over the world, for example, in California, the Sierra Nevada, agriculture in California is in very big trouble because they depend on snow melt up in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. That snow falls in the wintertime and melts throughout the summer. And by the end of the century, maybe even sooner, those rivers will run dry by the middle of the summer. And there's not enough space to build reservoirs to make up for the natural capacity of the mountains. This is actually true all over the West. This is a real problem. And the concern in the Himalayas and in the Tibetan Plateau is that these are rivers that essentially sustain agriculture for something like 3 billion people. This is a really big problem. There was a line in the IPCC report that somehow people missed that said that these glaciers would be gone by 2035. The truth is, we have no idea how long it's going to take to melt them. What it should have said was they might be gone by 2035. But as a result, there's an international investigation of the IPCC and the credibility because of this sentence out of 2,000 pages. Seriously, you can read all about it. So it is a tough time to be a climate scientist. I've got to say, though, when we think about values and the value of human flourishing, of simplicity, what Bill is talking about is so appealing in the sense of asking the question of, could we do less? Could we actually live better with less? And part of me thinks that that's something really to aspire to. And yet, when I actually think about the world energy systems, think about the systems that we've grown accustomed to, and it's not just grown accustomed to, in fact, have greatly improved the quality of our life in many ways. Not always. As Bill said, there's some things that I think in many ways less is more, but there's no question that you would rather be living here in Cambridge, Massachusetts today than living in Ghana right now, as an average person in Ghana. There's no question about it. In terms of infant mortality, in terms of adult mortality, in terms of health care, in terms of all sorts of things that we take for granted here. And I'm worried about the tough choices that lie ahead. And what I'm curious about getting into with Bill over the next, I don't know how long we have, half hour, 45 minutes, is the question of how do we deal with those tough choices, and more importantly, our social movements. And we need a social movement. I completely agree with Bill that we need a social movement. I'm not sure a social movement will be sufficient, but I suspect it will be necessary as a component of change. But the question is, how do social movements deal with hard choices? My concern is that many of the social movements that I've read about and studied over the years really had relatively simple ideas, relatively simple principles that they could apply. And unfortunately, for climate change, we're up for some very hard choices. You know, Bill mentioned the wonderful distribution of the virtues of distributed energy, in particular, for example, the photovoltaics on his home. Those are very expensive, and you're fortunate to be able to afford them. I can tell you that most people in this country couldn't afford them, and that would be a very difficult thing to do. Moreover, there are hard choices, even with renewable energy. Let me give you an example. Wind energy, for example, the density at which you can extract energy from the wind when you average out the spacing of windmills is something like 1 watt per square meter. Something like that, about 1 watt per square meter. In Wyoming, where they mine coal, Just to give you a comparison, the density in a square meter of land is something like 1 million times that, if you actually assume that you're going to use that over 100 years. Now, a coal mine is nothing pretty to look at, but it's very, very dense. Therefore, it's in one place. That's not to say that there are horrible, horrible effects of burning coal the way we do it today, but you have to realize what we're talking about is building not just a few windmills. We're talking about a lot of windmills. Already, Cape Wind is being opposed here. My friend who wants to build a solar thermal plant in the Mojave Desert has environmental groups completely in opposition because of concern over endangered species. And I actually suspect we're up for some very, very hard choices. And the questions of how we navigate those choices are not at all trivial. Environmental groups in the U.S., and even around the world, but especially in the U.S., over the last 40 years even, have really been built to oppose development. I think part of this is grounded, and many people here have studied this. Larry Buell and Bill are both very thoughtful about these issues. But I think some of it has to do with the pastoralism, the idea of wilderness and protection of wilderness, conservation movement, that essentially environmental groups have lobbied against building new stuff. Let's do less. That's kind of the spirit of what Bill was talking about. Let's make do with less. Fixing climate change, I would put forward, is in fact going to be the biggest build in the last 50 years. It's going to make the highway system seem trivial. It's about replacing the infrastructure that has driven the Industrial Revolution around the world over the last 150 years. It's about completely replacing it. The good news is it's not that expensive. It's something like 1% of GDP. To give you the perspective for the U.S., that's a couple $100 million a year or something like that. It's a lot, like a couple $100 billion a year. It's a lot of money, but it's not that much money compared to things like Iraq, right? No, a couple $100 billion is affordable. It's just a lot, right? We're willing to spend $20 billion a year. We're not ready to spend $200. But if we spent $200 billion for 30 years, we could fix the problem. But it's about building. It's about construction. It's about steel in the ground and concrete and massive building projects, every single one of which there are people who don't want it there. This is really becoming bigger and bigger issue. And there are real tough choices to be made because wilderness is important too. Right? I don't think you want windmills throughout the Adirondacks, Bill, and nor do I. And this is going to be a tough choice. Where do we decide? Is it Nantucket Sound that we don't want windmills? Where do we actually say it's okay? I don't have an answer for this. I just know that these are choices that we haven't really grappled with yet, and they're going to be very hard choices going forward. And I guess what I'm curious about, because we need a social movement to get going, the question is, this is a social movement like none I've ever seen that has to actually step forward and make some really difficult decisions and support making trade-offs. And it's hard to unify people when they disagree about those trade-offs. So I want to stop there and really open it up to Don first and then to other people in the audience who are very thoughtful about these issues, some of these people. But I think I'd really like to hear from Bill as well about how to navigate some of those hard choices. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Bill, would you like to respond first? There's a couple of... there's some microphones there that will...
Thank you. Those are such excellent questions. I mean, the first thing to say is that it's not just social movements that are bad at dealing with hard choices. It's, at the moment, it feels like our government has become completely paralyzed at the dealing with hard choices is just something they're literally almost not capable of doing. And compared to that, I think the record of social movements in dealing may not be so bad. But the points that you're making are very, very powerful. I mean, just take, for example, the wind thing in the Adirondacks, where I spent most of my life. 7 or 8 years ago, they proposed a big wind farm up on the ridge above the Siamese Ponds Wilderness Area, the navel of my universe, the place I spend more time probably almost any person on Earth, and just a place I love. I wrote a piece the week later for the New York Times op-ed page saying, build this as fast as you can. The threat to this place, the deep threat to this place, is the fact that there's not going to be winter there anymore in 40 years. And that, the flora and fauna that flourish there just simply have no shot at surviving unless we... Well, that did raise some hackles among some environmentalists, but frankly, most people that I know are of the like mind, It's like, okay, we understand that there are hard choices. We've got to get at them. One of those choices, I think, does have to do with doing, not just with building out everything, but also learning to do with a lot less, at least in terms of the energy that we use. As you know as well as anybody else, better than most people, an astonishing percentage of the energy that we use goes to no purpose. It's merely wasted. And some of that waste is technological, and some of it's also just craziness. We've spent the last 2 decades driving semi-military vehicles back and forth to the grocery store. Something that added to no one's utility in any meaningful way, but that we could easily dispense with. Once we've dispensed with some of that waste, then the possibility of doing things begins to get a little easier to do the math. You don't need quite so many wind turbines and quite so many solar panels, and much of the year I can run my house on the sunlight that falls on the shingles, and that's in northern Vermont. So it's not impossible to imagine. But we do need to build more, especially in other parts of the world where people don't have any energy now and would very much like to have some. One of the things we're doing, along with this October 10th thing, that we're doing this year at 350, that I hope something else that people will help us with, is what we're calling the Great Power Race. We're going to get campuses all over China, India, and the U.S. to be in a kind of friendly competition to who can be coming up with the most interesting renewable energy projects and sustainability projects on their campuses. In China and in India, the world looks very different than it does to us right now. People are very excited about the future and about the prospect for leaping ahead and all the things that they can do. And if we can take some of that energy and some of that human energy and hope and funnel it in the direction of clean, green technology, then we have a fighting chance. And I think we can. As I said earlier, I think the Chinese government is more supportive of many of these initiatives than our government is at the moment. It was very inspiring last week to watch when the GM had been desperately trying to unload Hummer they had a Chinese buyer lined up who was, for whatever reason, willing to pay some pittance, really, for a Hummer. And at the last minute, the Chinese government said, you know what? We don't really want to be associated with Hummer. You should not do this. And that was a useful example of the kind of steps that are being taken. But the question of social movements needing to mature is very true and needing to make hard choices. But the first thing that social movements need to do is build up enough pressure that our governments actually begin to do anything about this problem. It's always worth remembering that in the 22 years or so that we've really been in the global warming era, the United States Congress has a perfect, unblemished, bipartisan record of doing absolutely nothing on this question. And the same with many places. The House passed a bill, but nothing doesn't count unless everybody passes the bill. So that's right. Last year the House passed a bill, and that was a start. And we'll see. Maybe the Senate will pass a bill, but I don't think so. Not until we put some pressure on them. That's the irreducible mathematics. I mean, if the mathematics, and I completely agree with Dan's point I was trying to make, and he made it better with numbers about the difference between a coal mine and a wind farm. The density of power is, in that sense, is very true. The mathematics of politics is, if you can't build some kind of pressure on the other side, you don't have a chance. The coal industry spent $300 million last year, as Dan pointed out. I don't think we're going to raise $300 million to fight them, which means we're going to have to employ all the kind of creativity, passion and spirit that people began demonstrating at this 350 stuff last year to have any kind of a fighting chance. We'll see.
Thank you, Bill. Let me just raise a couple questions if I can. And both of you have done quite a bit of work in other countries. You've traveled a lot. You've seen a lot of different kinds of examples of environmental work. And I wonder if from that experience, either one or both of you would care to comment on that. Bill particularly mentioned at the sort of government level what's happening in China, and we've read a bit about it. But so much of what we think about, obviously, as Americans, and what you've said have been really very much from sort of, in a sense, a global perspective, but very much a U.S. perspective as well. So I wonder if there are examples that are worth mentioning. A second comment and question too. It strikes me that in terms of values, that to the degree that we talk about values and how we lead our lead our lives, the issue of lifestyle, that to the degree that this can be put in positive terms rather than negative terms, less, rather, what really is happiness and is a very different kind of lifestyle, less consumptive lifestyle, a lifestyle that is less surfeited with things. Are we in fact happier? So the degree that the value lifestyle question can be couched in really challenging positive terms. And then thirdly, finally, I love the way in which, Bill, you started talking about the local sort of markets. And in terms of food, I want to take that a somewhat different way that's perhaps related to my second point, and that is overconsumption of food. That is, there's a huge problem in this country of weight. So again, in terms of happiness and well-being, human well-being, to what degree can changes of diet in terms of eating less, but also the kinds of food that we eat, be used again as a kind of example to get at some of the issues that you're talking about. I'll stop there and see if either one of you would want to respond to those. Then we'll go to the audience.
I can say a couple of things. Those are all, Don, excellent points. The last one, because it's just sticking in my mind, is very. I produced more CO2 last year than entire small villages. I was on the move. I slept in my own bed about 60 nights last year because I was out everywhere just doing this organizing. And one of the things that is very striking about returning to the United States always is the sense that people are considerably larger here than any place else when you get back. And it's a sort of good. It raises. Dan made a very good point about how you wouldn't want to live in Ghana if you had the choice, maybe because life expectancy was lower or whatever, and it is. But it's also true that life expectancy in this country now isn't anywhere near the top of the league charts. I guess the point is, if there are underdeveloped nations in the world, there may also be overdeveloped nations in the world, or over-consuming nations at any rate, and we're a pretty good example of that. One of the pieces of kind of semi-good news is that there are some sort of happy mediums in here. I mean, the average Western European who has a much higher level of life satisfaction lives longer and also uses about half as much energy as the average American. All right? That's a good sign. Half doesn't solve global warming, but that's before you've changed technology at all. That's merely a result of different patterns of social organization and community structure, That's because they put a price on oil at the end of World War II was for the major reason that they didn't sprawl out into suburbs in the same sort of way that we did. It's the reason that they built and maintained a good rail system instead of, as Jim Kunstler said recently, having, as we do in this country, a rail system that Bulgaria would be ashamed of. Those are good indications of other possibilities. In terms of other countries doing other things, there's a lot of countries that are doing. My favorite leader in the world is this guy Mohammed Nasheed, who leads the entirely Muslim nation of the Maldives. Okay? And not only are they doing great symbolic job of things like those underwater cabinet meetings, they've also pledged that by 2020, their country will be entirely carbon neutral. They are building windmills and tide power plants and seaweed into gas things and whatever as fast as you can possibly do it. And it's very, very cool to see it because they're a poor country, and they have no reason other than an attempt to really morally persuade the rest of the world to go after it. But among other things, it's very inspiring to see that happen. One of the things that was most useful to me in this year was seeing how there's absolutely no shortage of visionary leaders on environmental issues in the Muslim world all over the place. And that was really neat to see happening, and it wasn't what I expected, frankly, going into all this.
So as far as other countries, I think it's interesting that the problem of climate change in terms of causing the problem is really about something like 20 countries. It's a much smaller number if you count the EU as one. Thank you, Bill. It's something like 20 countries. One of the challenges, and Bill mentioned the negotiations in Copenhagen, one of the problems with the whole process that was started in Rio long before, but then in Kyoto and now in Copenhagen, was that it involved 197 countries. And it turns out that it's hard to get the key 20 countries to actually have a serious discussion when there's 197 countries in the room. Practically, that's just really difficult. It's not that countries like the Maldives shouldn't have a voice. It's just that the truth is that most of the poor countries in the world are going to suffer from climate change, but have absolutely no bearing on the problem itself. That is, if we mend our ways and we develop clean energy, all the poor countries in the world will likely follow because we'll sell them the systems to do it. If we don't mend our ways, they will not either. And that's pretty much the way it is. That these 20 countries really are going to determine the way it goes. What's so interesting, as Bill says, is among those 20 countries, there are reasons not necessarily for great hope and inspiration, but I think Western Europe is an interesting example. Historically, as Bill said, that they had a tax policy that was quite different, placing a heavy energy tax as well as a heavy income tax on people because of a different welfare system, completely different. Some economists, if they were here, would say that their economic growth was much slower because of that. That may be so, but they seem to be pretty happy because of it. But here's the concern I have, that fundamentally, if you go to India, go to Singapore, ask them, who are they trying to catch up to? Who are they emulating? It's us. They're not trying to be Germany. They're not trying to be France. They're trying to be the U.S. Go to Shanghai. You'll see the same thing. So for whatever reason, what we're doing seems to be really cool to a lot of the rest of the world. We seem to be still with the model. And it would be nice if that were to change. And I think the battleground for me is places like India and Brazil. In China, in some ways, it's almost already done. But the development track of India and Brazil, for example, Indonesia, is very much in the future. South Africa perhaps as well. Watching what happens there in terms of choices that are made. Right now the rhetoric of the government is, we have a lot of poor people, we want to be building as many coal plants every year as China, we want to be producing as much steel every year as China. Those are the targets. In fact, I was at a meeting in Delhi 2 years ago where the finance minister of India said exactly that, and then the prime minister supported him in that. Those are the targets. The Chinese production targets for coal plants, for steel, for concrete, that's what India wants to aspire to. Double-digit growth every year for the next 30 years. And the question will come, and the U.S. is not going to be the country to tell them that there's a different path. The question is, which path will they choose? And what I spoke about there was not trying to shame India into being concerned about climate change. As an American, that's sort of an embarrassment, right? We are causing the problem, and barely doing anything, and I'm not going to tell them what to do. But I want to show them an example of air pollution in China. Show them what the question is, whether they actually have an opportunity to lead down a new path as opposed to follow the old path. And I think that's the angle with those countries that's so important.
Thank you, Dan. Let's now take some questions. John, I think you had a question.
Thank you so much, Bill, for your remarks and even more for your work. And Dan, thank you for your response. And again, the same feeling of hope in your work that you bring forward. This January, Mary Evelyn and I had the opportunity to hear Jaimesh Ramesh, the young environmental minister in India. And just to follow up on your remarks, he was concerned to elaborate India's environmental strides in relationship to China. He gave an extensive report on his participation in the basic discussions, namely Brazil, South America, and the India, China, the countries that had negotiated among themselves and that Barack Obama went to speak to at the end to come to an agreement. And he was positioning India, again, in terms of China in the environmental issue. My question that I wanted to raise was in terms of two gentlemen that were named by Thomas Friedman in an op-ed this Sunday who are from India, and he ended this op-ed by saying they have come to America to engage in their imaginative work in terms of the American dream. And this is the Bloom Energy box and the clean coal, spraying seawater on CO2 emissions in coal so as to create calcium carbonate, leading to a new possible manufacture. I wanted to draw you both out on those possibilities and the danger, of course, that they say situate us to continue simply business as usual. But these are new energy possibilities.
I think so Vinod Khosla and his colleague, Vinod founded Sun Microsystems, made a lot of money, and is now committed to using that money, he says, to transition us to a clean energy economy, albeit very aggressively investing and hyping his investments and getting people like Tom Friedman to write his advertisements in the New York Times. I don't know. I mean, Vinod Khosla is so good at networking that he could get 60 Minutes to essentially do a full network advertisement for him on Bloom Energy. And I don't really know about that system. I hope it works. Great. Although, we'll see. But wonderful if it did. If somebody can figure out how to make fuel cells cheap, that's fantastic. As far as the other company, which he mentioned, called Calera, I actually know a lot about it, and I should reveal to this audience, I actually have a financial stake in that company. And the reason is they licensed a patent that I filed with my graduate students. So I get 1% of all of their revenues. That being said, I am incredibly hostile to the company. I actually think it's a total scam, and I was shocked to see that Tom Friedman hyped it so much. The only thing that I felt good about was that he mentioned the rumor that I've heard as well before then, that Peabody Coal is about to make a big investment in the company, and therefore I'm going to hold my negative remarks from being public until Peabody Coal puts their money down, and then I will make sure that they lose every bit of that investment.
Yeah. The way we think, I think the way we're going to think about energy in the future is so much different than we have in the past. I've been saying for years, no silver bullets, maybe enough silver buckshot. If you add it all up, there's going to be a zillion different things going on. Lots of bets and lots of things to try. And that's why it's so interesting to sort of track what's happening in China and India, for instance. What's not clear in either case, it's clear that both of them are actually and I've spent some time with Ramesh too, he's an interesting guy, the Indian environmental minister. What's very clear is that they understand that there's opportunity here and they're going to do some interesting things. What's unclear is whether it's going to be a kind of sideshow to the main event of building more coal-fired power plants or whether it represents a transformative switch, and that's what we're trying to get at. And that's why we're doing this great power race and all this other stuff. And that's, in a sense, gets back to this question of politics. So Dan very ably, very correctly said that one of the things that makes it difficult to have these big UN things is that there's 197 players in the room. So, now we're talking about trying to do it with 20 players in the room. The trouble is that now it becomes like an AA meeting composed entirely of active drunks, who have no intention of laying down the bottle, and there's no one there to sort of tell them what to do, and they sort of organize the ground rules themselves. And that's why whatever sort of official negotiating sort of thing, there has to be worldwide political pressure to change the perception, to change the dynamic. Because right now nobody feels enough pressure to change. And that's what we keep trying to work on. And one of the good things is, I think that in the course of doing that, we'll at least begin to counter that very real problem of everybody trying to emulate the United States. It's not, partly that's because we unfortunately have our biggest export now is TV and motion pictures, sort of our vision of the American dream, and that's a problem. But it's also been a very conscious strategy of ours for a long time. It's not by accident, The General Agreement on Tariff and Trade and NAFTA and the WTO and things are all an effort to export precisely our idea of the world. When I'm in China now, meeting with mayors and things, one thing I keep saying, and it meets with increasing receptiveness, is pay no attention to Houston. This is not what you want your city to look like. Go look at Copenhagen. Go look at, these are the cutting edge cities in the world right now. They're the places where people actually enjoy their lives. You don't want to do Los Angeles. Los Angeles was a mistake. If we had it to do again, we'd do it differently, And that, I think, is... This year in China, many big cities inaugurated these great bus rapid transit systems, sort of subways on the street. That's a very good sign. And it's an idea they borrowed not even from Europe, they borrowed it from Curitiba in Brazil. Ideas beginning to spread laterally around the developing world. In the end, how ideas are going to move, I think, probably, is from the poor countries to the rich ones. We need really kind of mission work going from those places to this country in a lot of ways to help us understand what the future is going to look like.
We have a few more minutes. Question here, yes.
I want to also thank Bill for his work. I've been one of the people helping to organize some of these events, and it's because I admire what he's doing and also because I agree it's the most important problem we face. I have a moral question I'd like you both to respond to, and that is that Dan referred to how only about 12% of Americans are really concerned, or somewhere in the teens. And I just read a statistic that among NSTAR customers in this state, only 1% have signed up to pay a little extra for green energy, including ourselves, I'm happy to say. But with so few people acting, and with the government, our government, doing so little to get the word out, to quote my brother who listens to me and says, Roger, if this is a problem, why doesn't the government tell us it's a problem, or why don't they do something about it? So the moral question to me is, why doesn't our government get the word out to the people like they did, for example, when you had the civil defense system when I was a kid? The ICBMs are coming in. We need to head for the fallout shelters. And with climate change, it's on a geologic time scale, which we didn't evolve to appreciate, but it doesn't mean it's any less real. So where's the government to get the word out about the problem?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think the answer is, if you actually paid attention, this government has been getting the word out. If you ever listened to Steve Chu, he was here giving our commencement address last year. This was what he talked about.
Yeah, I was here.
And John Holdren, my colleague and professor at the Kennedy School in Earth and Planetary Sciences for the last 15 years, is now President Obama's science advisor. And the government is actually acting. The head of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, has now gone to Southern Company and a number of the other big utilities that burn a lot of coal, and has said that now they are starting to an act, and they've told them that the first rule that's going to come out is the rule on new power plants, and they're going to set the emission standard for new power plants essentially at the level that a gas plant is, which means by EPA regulation there will be no new coal plants in the U.S. That don't capture the carbon. And that's phenomenal. Now, that'll get litigated, that'll get tied up in the courts, but frankly, a lot of people said, EPA is a terrible way to do it. Obama says, well, let's just do it and see where it goes. So the government is trying. But you've got to understand, there's a lot of money on the other side. A lot of money on the other side. And unfortunately, some people trying to make a buck even on the right side. For example, NSTAR will sell you green power. It's never been clear to me that money actually encourages, since there are renewable portfolio standards in Massachusetts anyway, it's not clear that extra money has any effect on building of additional clean power in Massachusetts. Essentially, it's just more money going to NSTAR. They'll sell you power from Pilgrim Nuclear Plant, for example, which is going to run anyway, regardless of whether you paid that extra charge. So there are people. It's tough. It's a very difficult issue. But I think the government is acting.
Look, it's a measure of, the Obama administration's done more than all the previous administrations of the global warming era combined. That bar was set remarkably low, so, and what they haven't done yet, yes, they've done good things. Obama hasn't yet figured out whether or not he's willing to commit, I think, significant political capital to really pushing an aggressive bill through Congress. And
capital that he really doesn't have.
He may not have as much of anymore. We'll see. But he hasn't. It's true that Stephen Chu's given some great talks. It's also true that Obama has not. This has not been the thing that he's decided to highlight, to make the centerpiece of his presidency. And look, healthcare is very important, but this is, we're not seeing action on the scale that we need. We're seeing a lot more action than we've seen in the past. The thing that I always try to get through when I'm talking to politicians and things, that this is the reason that this is unlike other problems that they're used to dealing with, is that it comes with a time limit. That is, there is a certain point in the not very distant future when it won't matter at all what the President of the United States does or doesn't do about this, because we will have raised the temperature enough that the permafrost will have begun to melt and methane will be pouring into the atmosphere or whatever it is, at which point our flexibility and possibility for action will have disappeared. In that sense, it's not like healthcare. If we don't manage to pass healthcare reform, well, people are going to suffer for the next 10 years, and then we'll come back, and it won't have materially made it, impossible to deal with healthcare 10 years hence. I hope we deal with healthcare now, but if we don't deal with climate change pretty soon, then we won't deal with it. The physics of it are very, very different than other things and that's. Maybe one way of saying this, what I've sort of said in the past sometimes, is we're used to this political process, of always, and it works the way that it probably should for the most part, of always bargaining. So, if you're going to, it's changing the whole healthcare system overnight would be so disruptive that maybe it makes more sense to do it piece at a time and whatever else, and come back in 10 years and do some more. And the trouble with climate change is the negotiation that's underway at bottom isn't between energy companies and environmentalists, the U.S. and China, Republicans and Democrats. All those pieces are in play and in motion, but the real negotiation that's going on is between human beings on the one hand and physics and chemistry on the other. And that's a very tough negotiation, because physics and chemistry really just sort of stick to their bottom line. Jim Hansen said, well, their bottom line is 350. They're unlikely to sort of say, well, your economy is in a rough patch. We'll sort of suspend the laws of nature for a decade or two until you get it under control, and then we'll, make up for it. That's the problem, and that's the reason that we took this. One of the reasons that we took this very obscure scientific data point, in a sense, 350, and tried to push it into the fit debate, if nothing else to make the point that there's a kind of reality principle at work here that needs to be respected. And that's unfortunately the thing against which we have to measure political process and progress. Not was it better than what we've done before, but does it rise to the thing that physics demands?
Unfortunately, I think we should bring this to a close and continue the discussion informally. Both Dan and Bill will join us across the street at the reception at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Let me remind you that there's some literature here on the table to pick up as you go out if you wish. And actually, the reception is a test because we know that less is more. So, you've got to tone down the amount of food you eat at the reception. But please join us and join me in thanking